Welcome to Resilient World. I'm your host, Christine Mormuth, Director of the Adrienne Arsht Center for Resilience here at the Atlantic Council. Resilience is a big tent idea that can mean different things to different people. We at the Atlantic Council see resilience as a mindset, a way of approaching problems with an eye towards figuring out how to build capacity to bounce back more quickly from the challenges coming at us every day. Whether it's terrorism, natural disasters, global pandemics, cyber attacks, or even disinformation campaigns. Resilient World features conversations with individuals who are thought leaders when it comes to resilience. Thank you for listening. Our guest today is retired Coast Guard Admiral Peter Neffenger, who has plenty of firsthand experience dealing with everything from natural disasters to making transportation systems resilient in the face of a variety of security threats. We're excited to have him with us today. Admiral, thank you for being with us. Before leaving government just a year ago, Admiral Neffenger was the head of the Transportation Security Administration, an organization I'm sure everyone knows, and what I can only imagine was a very hard job. I know that nowadays you spend a lot of time on airplanes and airports, but I imagine some part of you is perhaps a little relieved to not be the point man for Congress when the security lines at the airports get really long, or when the threat evolves and yet another new rule gets put in place. Admiral Neffenger joined the Coast Guard when he was only 25 years old and seems to have done almost every job as a Coastie. He was assigned to American Samoa in the early 90s. He worked assignments on the Gulf Coast early in his career and then later had major command jobs at the ports of both San Francisco and Los Angeles. In 2010, Admiral Neffenger was named the Deputy National Incident Commander during the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. And as if that wasn't tough enough, he took over TSA in June of 2015. So again, thank you very much. And why don't we just jump in right away to your experience at Deepwater Horizon. Many of you may remember the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, but it was an incredibly complex disaster. There was the terrible fire and eventually the sinking of the oil rig, the oil spill that became a true environmental disaster, and then there was sort of the slowly unfolding event that had huge economic impacts all across the Gulf Coast. And of course, the incredibly complex engineering challenge of trying to cap the well many, many, many feet under the ocean's surface. Peter, I understand that actually in the midst of the unfolding spill, you had the opportunity to brief President Obama on what was happening with the wellhead. Can you sort of remember that and take us back a little bit and describe what you had to tell President Obama and how he reacted to that and what decisions were you all trying to make?
Well, first, thank you, Christine, for the opportunity to be with you today. It's, I think this is pretty exciting what you're doing here at the Atlantic Council, and the resilience as a system is a great way of thinking, and there's probably no better illustration of what happens when you don't think about resilience as a system than to look at some of the disasters that we've dealt with. The Deepwater Horizon oil spill was really fascinating. Just to put it in perspective, from April 20th until July 15th, there was a spill the size of the Exxon spill every single day for all those consecutive days. I think it's 78 some consecutive days.
I will never forget seeing on CNN every day the sort of underwater camera footage of the wellhead, pumping out the oil.
It was a very high pressure well as well. So I mean, it was quite a productive well, and you saw that in that footage. Of course, there was the downside to having that footage every day was the questions you would get would be, if they can get a picture of it, why can't you stop it? Not recognizing that it was 5,000 feet below the surface and there was no way to get a human down there to work on it. But to your question about briefing President Obama, my first briefing to him was about 2 weeks after the spill, and we had some time to get a feel for the extent of it. We still hadn't realized how much was coming out. If you recall, there was a lot of controversy over the amount that was being spilled, but clearly we knew that we had a lot coming out. And like any president, he wanted to know exactly what's happening. We didn't have a lot of good information, but what I found with President Obama was that he was comfortable with ambiguity. He was comfortable with not knowing all the answers. He was not comfortable with people not having tried to find out as much as they possibly could at any given moment. So the key was to ensure that you had the most up-to-date information, even if it was tentative and even if it was uncertain, so that he was aware of at least what was being said at that moment. So it was a real challenge because you had multiple things going on. That oil spill was actually a multiple events. People think of it as an oil spill, but it was really an event of magnitude. The oil spill itself, the technical challenge of trying to plug that well, which was separate from the spill. You had the cleanup of the oil at the surface of the water right above the well location, which was about 75 miles off the coast of Louisiana. And then you had the potential for oil to come ashore. So you had all these different events going on at once, and you had to break those down into the pieces so that what you wanted the president to get is a good picture for the magnitude and the scope of the problem, and the both geographically as well as politically. So ultimately, there were 5 Gulf states that were affected by this oil spill, either directly or indirectly. You had 5 governors of those 5 Gulf states that were affected, and then multiple parishes and counties and so forth. So the key that first day was just to try to somehow, in that 30-minute window that you had, to paint the extent of that picture so that you had the maximum amount of flexibility to operate. And it was fascinating. He asked very hard questions, and there was you could see a lot of the old law school professor in him when you're sitting in front of him. It was intimidating too. I'll be honest with you. This is the first time I've sat in the Roosevelt Room of the White House with most of the cabinet sitting around you, all the senior staff from the White House Chief of Staff, the National Security Advisor, the Homeland Security Advisor, and the President sitting right across from
pressure.
you. No pressure. And you're the guy in the uniform that they look to and say. Actually, it was very funny. He walked in. He said, "You in the uniform. You look like you might know what's going on. Start talking," and that's how it happens.
Was there a time where, I remember I was working at the Defense Department at that time, and we were primarily focused with trying to help with as you described it, dealing with the oil on the surface of the water, and
yes.
Trying to find, I forget even what it was called, the material that kind of helps corral the oil, and we were working with all sorts of countries who were contributing. But I remember that we had a series for a period of time. All that summer we had DCs and PCs, at least a couple times a week. But I do remember a sort of an intense period where we were trying to figure out, could the well be capped?
Yes.
How could we do it? I remember being grateful at that time that we had both John Holdren as the head of the Office of Science and Technology Policy, and then also the Secretary of Energy, who had a very technical background and was able to talk to the president. Can you sort of walk us through what you remember of literally talking to the president about the challenges around trying to cap the well? Understanding that, as you just said, we didn't have all of the information. We had never done this before and didn't really know whether what people were proposing was going to work.
That's right. And I think it's, if you'll indulge me a bit, Christine, it's worth talking a little bit about what that challenge looked like. So you've got this wellhead, 5,000 feet below the surface. The well itself was another 13,000 feet below the seafloor. So it was a very deep well. That's why the name of the rig, the Deepwater Horizon. It was a rig built to do oil exploration in very deep waters. So there's a device called a blowout preventer that's typically put on top of a well that's in process of being drilled, and it's nothing more than a stack of valves of different types that are designed to ensure that if you have any kind of a problem with the well, like you get a blowout of pressure or a kickback of well pressure, that you can close the valves in a way that then seal off the well and allow you to then take action to either cement the well in or do whatever needs to be done to ensure that you push the pressure back down. And they do that in multiple ways, either with a heavy fluid that they pump down through the well string or by ultimately cementing the well in if they can't stop the flow otherwise. Well, that blowout preventer was not much different than the kind you would see sitting on land on a well. It's supposed to fail to safe. And in this case, it didn't fail to safe. The blowout preventer failed. There were a number of reasons why that happened. And you had this jumble of stuff, equipment. So blowout preventer, you had 5,000 feet of drill string that had collapsed on top of the well. You had the drill rig itself that had collapsed down. So it wasn't a clean well. By the time you saw that picture on CNN, most of that equipment had been cleaned away from the wellhead so that you could actually see what was going on at the wellhead itself. But in the early stages, it was just a jumble of equipment piled on top of the well. So just sorting through all that was a challenge. So the first steps was understanding, first of all, what is actually leaking? It wasn't really clear because there was oil coming out of everywhere because of all that jumble of equipment. And so those first steps, it was having Secretary Chu, Stephen Chu was the Secretary of Energy. He brought a pretty impressive team in. You had all of the well engineers from BP and even other major oil companies. So this was a very big operation that was being managed out of Houston. And then staging all the equipment that would allow you to go down and take a look at what's going on. All that was done with remotely operated vehicles, so deep sea vehicles, again, not with no humans on board, just remotely operated, tethered. At one point, there were some 100 or so of these
wow.
working around together. The choreography of those alone was challenging. So the first step was to paint a picture, and we put a lot of work into actually creating graphics that just illustrated relative positions of things, so that you could begin to think about sequencing some of the work to remove all of the items. Once you cleared off the well site, then you could begin to see what the real challenge was. And so the basic challenge was this. It was unclear, first of all, if you've looked at the way wells are drilled, think of it as a telescope. You've got successively smaller diameter pipes that are cemented one to another until you reach the formation. So at the top there might be I'll say 12 to 15 inch diameter pipe, and at the bottom it might be 4-inch diameter pipe. And so it's just a telescoping series of these. That goes down through a formation of varying density. So there was a question about how intact that well string was. Did it get damaged in the blowout? What the nature of the formation was around it. So we had Dr. Marcia McNutt, who at the time was the U.S. Geological Survey, the head of the U.S. Geological Survey, now the president of the National Academies of Sciences. She was the foremost geologist, so she was there to help understand the formation. And then to determine, since you have this real high pressure, if you suddenly cap something at high pressure, if that well's not intact, is it going to blow out into the formation and then make matters even worse? So there's a lot of reason why that wellbore was allowed to keep spewing out for some time, because it wasn't clear that if you capped it, you wouldn't just make a disaster out of it and then obviate or completely eliminate the ability to cap it.
When you say disaster, do you mean something like, for example, that pressure that was building up had to go somewhere, and was the risk that if we tried to cap it without fully understanding the formation, mm-hmm. that the pressure would disseminate horizontally and potentially maybe create, and go up through the seafloor in multiple places? It's
exactly what the concern was. In fact, there was one point where I remember one scientist said, apparently it was a type of formation that was relatively sandy and loose. It wasn't a real rocky formation. And so one scientist said, if we could have a catastrophic release into the formation, meaning exactly what you said, it blows out horizontally through the side, and then you just have oil coming up out of everywhere.
And no way to stop it.
And no way to stop it, because you no longer have a defined, entry point that you can cap. So there was lots of concern over that. It wasn't clear, and in fact, even at the time on July 15th, when we had gotten to the point where a device had been fabricated to mate up to the spewing oil, there was a lot of work that had to be done to create a connection there, because the other one had been damaged. That device was in place, and the question was, do we close the valves? And I remember that was a very interesting meeting at the White House Situation Room with the President, Stephen Chu, Secretary of Energy, Admiral Thad Allen, who was the National Incident Commander, myself, and the slew of other people that were involved, as well as a number of the engineers and scientists, walking through the relative risk level associated with turning the valve, because there was two concerns. One, once you close it, it wasn't going to be easy to reopen it, because the public and political pressure would have been too great. Second was, it was going to be some time before you knew whether or not the formation had blown out, because they put a lot of pressure valves or gauges and so forth on, but it wasn't. But they expected some pressure fluctuation when they first did it. So it was really fascinating to see, how the decision was finally made to just shut it off, and it wasn't 100% certainty. I mean, there were people who dissented from that. They said, we should not do this because I don't think the wellbore is intact. I think we're going to have real problems. As it turns out, it worked out really well, and it's a testament, I think, to the people who were trying to interpret results from something that they'd never had to interpret results from before. It was so those were some really interesting, fascinating, and challenging days, and anxiety-filled days. I think that anyone who wants to study that really ought to study what was happening in Houston, the crowd that was working to actually secure that wellhead. The rest of it is pretty, it's pretty catastrophic in terms of the amount of oil spilled, but that's a cleanup process, and it did a lot of damage. There are long-term environmental damages that are yet to be assessed. But that's fairly straightforward compared to this very challenging thing. I think at one point someone said it was like Apollo 13, 5,000 feet below the surface.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I was thinking of. Is I love Apollo 13, the movie, and one of the things I think it does exceptionally well is tell sort of the behind-the-scenes story of how the people back at Mission Control figured out how to manufacture a solution and then work with the team on the space capsule. And it sounds like very much that there's a similar story to be told there. The movie Deepwater Horizon does a great job dramatizing, the terrible events that happened on the rig. It doesn't get into the aftermath at all. But there's another story. It feels
I
like
think that would be a fascinating story, and it would be just as compelling and just as suspenseful as the Apollo 13. Because having lived through that, it wasn't clear in any given day that you were going to be successful. I think there's always a belief you can be successful. I don't think anybody believed it would go on forever. But it wasn't clear that any particular approach was going to be successful. And if you can recall, there were lots of approaches that were the subject of late-night comics and things like that. Because there's funny terminology in the oil industry, just like there is in any industry. They had what they call junk shots and capping stacks and the like. So those things got picked up just like any lingo does. But I can tell you that there was real seriousness in that, and it was fascinating to watch. There were arguments, as you can imagine. There were people who vehemently disagreed with one another, but it was interesting to watch how they kept reminding themselves of the objective, and they said, "Look, whatever, we've got to figure out how to plug this thing. So let's keep reminding ourselves what we agree upon, and we'll just keep working on these things that we're having trouble with."
One of the things I've reflected on as I've thought about whether it was Deepwater Horizon or the terrible tsunami and nuclear event in Japan or Hurricane Sandy, the Obama administration over the course of its 2 terms faced a whole number of natural disasters and crises and managed their way through them. And the team of all those people who did that at the very, very senior level, but even in many cases, 2 or 3 levels down, have all turned over. And this is what happens, obviously, in our great democracy every 4 to 8 years. What is your assessment of how well, we have a new president, a new administration, all of the people who had built up quite a bit of expertise with crises are gone, and there's a new set of folks. How well, based on what you've seen, not just during your time sort of at the end, but your whole Coast Guard career, do you feel like our system is set up so that we retain some amount of institutional memory and pass on the lessons learned from one crisis to the next effectively? Or do you think there's more that we should be trying to do to make sure that we have greater continuity of that expertise from administration to administration?
Well, that's a really important insight and a really important question you've asked. I'll answer that in a couple parts, and I'll start at the local level. I will tell you that I think that when you get down to the local level, there's a lot of continuity in terms of the ability to respond. So the really wonderful thing about this country is that we're very good at just getting to work and fixing things right away. So I don't worry too much about the immediate response, and I say that with some qualification. If you have a big catastrophic event, it overwhelms the local capacity. So if you start with small manageable crises, a tornado comes through and does a significant amount of damage, but it hasn't wiped out all the infrastructure, then I think that there's a lot of residual capacity from year to year. And that carries forward because those people are career people. This is what they do. So fire departments and police departments and emergency managers. I mean, there's a very robust emergency management community in this country. And depending upon where you are, it's appreciably better or appreciably not so good. But it's all pretty good. And there are places where there are big mutual aid associations where on a statewide level, California is a good example where they have the state mutual aid program where you rapidly see resources flowing in from elsewhere when somebody needs it. So you can look at the big fires that have happened or the recent mudslides and so forth, and you watch people come from all over the state. And there's a strong emergency managers association across the country. So that I think is really good, and it's comforting to know that that's there, and people should be comforted. That's also tied up through the federal level, and it goes through the federal level in a couple of ways. You go up through the state National Guard sort of system, but the National Guard is tied to the federal side, and then of course the Federal Emergency Management Agency, which really is it's as much a coordinating agency as it is a response agency. I mean, what they will tell you is that first and foremost, they bring resources to bear.
That's right.
That they're not first responders, although they are often there with the first responders. But what they are is support for all of the response that has to happen. The challenge at the federal level is rapidly getting political appointees in place. That's important because, I mean, you have a lot of career people that carry through. I don't worry about organizations like the Coast Guard or the Department of Defense or others because you've got lots of depth there. You know, you'll never hurt for people they're all career. They know what they're doing. They've been well trained. I mean, everybody grows up learning certain types of systems. The real problem is in all of those other agencies that don't know that they're necessarily part of a response. So I think back to my Deepwater Horizon experience, there were many entities within the federal government that wouldn't think of themselves as first responders, but they were critically important to the response. And so I think what you lose I think administrations have to make it a specific priority to be prepared for emergency. And not just in the places where you expect to be prepared, FEMA, the DOD, and Coast Guard, and whatever. And I think that's the challenge. And I don't think any administration gets it right. And that's not meant to be a criticism. It's just you have 1,000 things you got to deal with when you come in as a brand new administration. But these are the things that are immediate and right now. And everyone hopes that you don't have a big crisis, but if you do, you really kind of need to be ready, and you have to have thought about it beforehand because thinking about it when it happens is the wrong time. Then you have people just running around going crazy. So I think there's a couple of things you could do. I mean, take advantage of the fact that you have lots and lots and lots of expertise at the federal level, whether it's in or out of service. So I don't know if there's almost, you could almost think of putting together a cadre of experts or senior advisors that just serve as a standing body, and maybe that's appointed by a president, or maybe it's just a standing body that is available for expertise. You know, hey, here are some things to think about. Not that you're going to be a shadow government trying to run something, but just a series of a repository of all the lessons that have been painfully learned, so that you don't actually have to relearn a lot of the hard lessons right up front.
Yeah, no, that's a great idea. And I think it's similar vein. I understand that at the end of the last administration, because of the experience that they had with H1N1, Ebola, and then Zika, that actually they did develop a written sort of playbook for some of the big decision points, explicitly with the thought of, hey, let's try to pass this on to try to help, as you said, the new team be prepared from day one. Well, I'm sure we could talk quite a bit more about Deepwater Horizon, but I don't want to miss the opportunity to also talk about something totally different, but is also equally important and equally about having the resilience of a large system. And that's your time as the director of the Transportation Security Agency, which is, for most Americans, not a very popular agency because we tend to see the TSA folks at the airport and we're all already stressed about getting on our flights and irritated to be taking off our shoes. But I think at the same time, most Americans still remember quite well 9/11 and understand why we have that kind of security. And frankly, with each unfortunate terrorist attack in other places like Europe, it's a reminder of why we have TSA and why we need it. You and I were talking sort of before we started. You came in as director at a challenging time. The Inspector General had just released a report saying that sort of, test screeners who were essentially charged with trying to sort of sneak in materials that are not supposed to be able to get on board had been able, quite a few of them had sort of slipped through the net. There was a lot of criticism about that. There was a period where we were having quite long lines at many of the airports nationwide. So that was a very challenging time when you started. I would love for you to talk a little bit about one of the things I understand that you did that was a very significant change and I think made a big difference was to start a daily conference call out of your command center with all of the major airports. And that kind of synchronization had not been happening before you were the director. Can you talk about why you decided to do that and what you think that did and how that made TSA more effective?
So I did that. We were about, I guess I was about 9 months into my tenure when we did that, chose to do that. And so I'm going to back up a little bit and just do kind of a rapid walk up to what made that decision, or what got us to that point that we made a decision to do this daily operational phone call. As I came in, I was in between my 2 confirmation hearings. So TSA has 2 committees of jurisdiction.
Lucky you.
Yeah, they don't tell you that when they nominate you. But so I'd had my first confirmation hearing with the Senate Commerce Committee. That's the primary committee of jurisdiction. And about a week and a half later, I was slated to have my second confirmation hearing before the Senate Homeland Security Committee. So the first hearing was the Inspector General report had not been released, and it actually wasn't released. It was leaked. Somebody leaked the report. It got picked up by ABC News. It was a classified report, but ABC News published it, and it put out the results that you just mentioned, and that basically suggested TSA couldn't do its job. And so that report came out after my first confirmation hearing, but before my second. So the tenor of the second hearing was completely different. I would say, from my perspective, TSA was in full-blown crisis. I wasn't the administrator yet. In fact, I didn't actually officially become the administrator until July 4th. So the report came out in late May, or was leaked in late May. I had my second hearing the first week of June or so, and then I took the job. They got voted out towards the end of June. I took the job on July 4th. And so during that time, I was watching this crisis unfold. And if you recall, just about every major news channel had some version of TSA failed across the ticker tape on the bottom of the screen. When I got to TSA, I inherited what Secretary Jay Johnson had begun to establish. He put in place what he called a tiger team to figure out what happened. And I inherited that team, and I worked on changing the focus of it a lot. I really wanted to do a deep root cause on what happened. I mean, it wasn't clear to me what the tests actually showed. And I know there's going to be somebody out there who says, it showed you failed. But that's it. Yes, it showed there were failures, but it wasn't clear if the failure was of individuals, was of equipment, or of a system. But because the test results were different from different airports. So we really need to understand the failure before you can begin to figure out what to fix. So we did this deep dive root cause analysis and found about 12 categories of things that were systemic. And because I've always believed that if you have a big failure like that, it's not the people. There's something wrong with the system. People rarely get up in the morning and go, I'm just going to let the terrorists through today. Something went wrong. So we found training problems. We found, as it turns out, we didn't have a well-coordinated centralized training program. We had a real focus on efficiency over effectiveness. That goes back to your comment about the long lines. People were yelling at TSA, so they said find a way to get people through faster. And you had a real disconnect between the front line and the management of the organization. So what I wanted to do was flip it around and do what we always said in the military, which is you wake up at the mission end of the organization, and every day that's the end of the organization. Because if that fails, it doesn't matter, everything else you're doing is irrelevant, because that's the point of failure. And I also wanted to understand why this most critical national security job in the United States was so disliked by so many people. Because if you think about it, it's one of the most important jobs in the country. Everything depends upon those screeners doing it right when it comes to ensuring that people aren't carrying things through. And we know that there are groups out there that still want to do it. So this is not an exercise in play acting. This is the real thing. So, anyways, long story short, what we found is that no surprise, TSA was formed in crisis right after 9/11. Was told go out there and fix the thing that failed, and did so. Kind of with this, what ultimately develops into this, only we can get it right. And so if you're not careful, you kind of wall yourself off from the community. So one of the other things we did was I said, how much does TSA really control in an airport environment? And how much do other people control? Turns out that TSA doesn't control everything. You've got airlines and airports and vendors and taxi cab drivers and everything else. So over the course of, so that was in the summer of 2015. We did a rolling stand down over a couple months where we retrained the entire workforce, management included, said, here's what happened, here's how we're going to change, we built a training academy so that we could boost training. All of that was designed to rapidly get better at what we did. Well, at the same time, we wanted to rebuild confidence in the organization, not just because you want people not yelling at you anymore, but you also don't want your adversary to see a window of opportunity. Well, in the process of doing that, I knew that the lines were going to get long again because we changed some practices that in retrospect were pretty risky practices that slowed down the lines. And we didn't have enough people out. The other thing we discovered is that from 2011 to 2015, TSA had reduced its frontline workforce by about 13%. In the face of a growth in passenger volume over that same time. So as passenger volume's going up, you've got numbers of screeners going down, and we had the classic supermarket problem. You go to the supermarket on the busiest day of the week, and 2 of 12 cashiers are open. You can imagine what you're going to expect. So I wanted to get to the point where we could get all the lanes open. I mean, all of us had experiences when we went to an airport, and only 3 or 4 lanes were open, and you see all these empty lines out the door, and you think,
what's going on here?
What's going on here? Well, what was going on is there just weren't any people. So I worked with Congress to get the money to start a training academy and to rehire. One, to turn off the continued downturn, and then to begin rehiring people. There's a long leg for that. So over the course of the fall and the early spring, it looked as if we were going to have some significant problems. And if you recall, we had one real bad problem in Chicago. And at that point, it wasn't clear to me what the challenge was. So as it turns out, you can't manage the security line from the security checkpoint, because you put ridiculous pressure on screeners to not do their job. You should just move them faster. You need to manage the approaches to the line separate from the line itself. And so I came back from Chicago and I said, we're going to figure out how to fix this. I said it's going to start by having, I want to set up an operations center, and I said I want it focused on checkpoints and lines. And I said I want to do a daily phone call with airlines, airports, and TSA, airport by airport. I said, you help me figure out how many airports we need to do. And I said, we'll just start talking through this problem, and I think we'll see if we can fix it. But we don't have enough information. Because as it turns out, we were staffing based upon information that was predicted by what's called the secure flight system. That's where your name goes when you make a reservation. But we weren't necessarily comparing it against real-time data that airlines were getting about who's actually arriving, who's checked in. That's just a prediction, that secure flight system, but the airlines have a much clearer picture of who's actually going to be there at any given moment. And then the airports can tell you what the crowds look like. So we started with the top 7 airports in the country, and it turns out that top 7 airports is about over 50% of the daily travel volume. And in one day, the line problem went away.
Wow.
That was astonishing. I didn't expect that. I just thought we were going to start learning more about the problem. Well, it turns out that if you talk to the people who collectively have all the information you need to figure out when people are going to arrive, you can distribute lines in a very methodical and direct way that dramatically reduces the incidence of line creep. So we got to the point. We set a time. We said, look, we were having 2-hour-long waits. I said, I want a flag to go up if we get anywhere close to 20 minutes, because if we get to 20 minutes, it's like a traffic jam. You'll be at an hour or 2 hours in no time. And so I give great credit to the TSA staff. They built this war room that was fantastic, and it had checkpoint by checkpoint, I mean lane by lane, airport by airport. We eventually got to the top 30 airports because that represents about 80% of the travel volume. If you can fix those, the other airports are fine. And the problem was never at small airports. It was always at Chicago, L.A., New York, Atlanta, places like that. Some of it's, and each airport's slightly different because some of it's because of the constraints that they have. So long story short, turns out if people talk to one another, first of all, you create relationships that hadn't existed before. You create a sense of community. You create, the operational unit becomes the airport, not TSA airline. And you create this very interesting positive competition, that just was a byproduct of it.
Who can manage
so when
most effectively?
Airport A hears that Airport B wasn't having trouble, and they're thinking, we're not going to be the ones to report problems, because all their bosses are listening. The CEOs of all the airlines were listening in on the first couple of weeks of calls. And so an airline operation manager at an airport doesn't want to be the one to say, I'm not working effectively with my partners. So it was fascinating. And the system really fixed, and they began to develop procedures and policies that nobody had even thought of before. So all sorts of innovative ideas came out of that, and including embedding all the support and logistics people in the operational call, so that you no longer put a trouble ticket in on a piece of equipment that went down and waited for 3 weeks to get it fixed. We went from an average repair time of about 2 to 3 weeks to 2 to 3 hours on equipment. So you were getting stuff back up in gear a real way. It changed we changed all of our contracts on our suppliers and on our maintenance contracts. So it was fascinating to see, and they still do it today. They run, it's every day, 10:30 Eastern time, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. And it's just become a way of doing business. So it was fascinating to see how that just changed the whole dynamic. So now you might have a period where you'll have a long line, but it's not hours long. Mm-hmm. Before, if you had an hour-long wait, that would be an hour-long wait for 8 hours. Eight hours of an hour-long wait. Right. Whereas now they might get one, but they rapidly advance. They go out and they tell people, look, it's going to be a long wait right now. Here's how long it's going to happen. And then they clear it out. They redistribute people to other lines. And so now you have a real collaborative effort. It was fascinating to see. So you really build the resilience into the system by connecting the system to one another.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the things we found at the Resilience Center is that resilient systems, whether it's a sort of an airport security system or a natural system, tend to have common traits. Mm-hmm. Sort of 6 or 7 traits that most of them demonstrate. And one of those traits is connectivity,
yeah.
and another one of those traits is participation. Is it a system that allows multiple stakeholders
Exactly.
at multiple levels to be able to plug in? And it sounds like by instituting that call, bringing in the participants that you all had, you built the capacity of the system to have greater participation, greater connectivity, and to increase the resilience, which is great. So that's a great example of a concrete thing you did that it sounds like paid real dividends. With your experience as administrator, looking forward, now that you're out of that role, what do you see on the horizon for how aviation security is going to evolve? I mean, this is a time where there are huge advances in artificial intelligence. I've already seen at airports a program that is allowing passengers to do retinal screening if they want. We've seen things like PreCheck come in. Where, sort of 5 years from now, what do you think airport security is going to look like in the United States? Is it going to look substantially similar to where we are now, or do you see it potentially evolving in some pretty notable ways?
No, I think there's a real opportunity not just to evolve, but to really transform the system. There will always be a need for something like a checkpoint, but the vision that I have, and I think that many others who think about this have, is that the checkpoint becomes just one small component of a distributed system. Right now, if you think about it, what we have is aggregated security, and it's primarily around things like barriers and perimeter locks and locked doors and checkpoints. And the general thought is, okay, unsecure on one side of it, secure on the other side, but it's pretty dark on both sides. I mean, it's not really clear that you really know anything about what's happening on either side. I mean, you assume that everybody you've screened is safe and good to go, but there's not a lot of knowledge about the movement and flow of people and things in the system. So if you think about what are the 3 key elements of security, you want visibility. I want to see the things and the people moving through. You want identity to the maximum extent possible. I want to know who those things and people are, who or what they are, cargo and people and so forth, bags. And then I want to know why they're there. What's the purpose? The purpose is generally directly, implied by identity and visibility. If you're there at an airport and you got a bag in your hand and you got a boarding pass, well then it's pretty certain that you're there to take a flight, especially if that boarding pass is for a flight that's happening that day and it's within the couple hours time that you're there. But that's hard to get without I mean, it's hard to get for a number of reasons. One, data exists in little islands of information, Uber, Lyft, airlines, TSA, and so forth. It's also hard to get because people are reluctant to open up their identity and their visibility. But what I see is an opportunity to take advantage of what people are already comfortable opting into, whether it's things like pre-check or your social media or the like. I mean, we as a people generally make lots of private data available to people, understanding that it's used within reason. So I think there's an opportunity to think about how you could begin to connect those data streams controlled by the individual. So to the extent that you allow yourself to be identified, and there's all sorts of interesting technology foundations out there like blockchain and others that may provide a way to do so in a more secure way, in a way that you control, that you own your data, you control access to it, you become the security token yourself that allows handshakes to take place. So one is better visibility and identity across the system as you're moving through it. Temporal in nature, so when I arrive, when I depart, see me for that time and then it goes away. If I can do that in a way that convinces me that nobody's taking advantage of my data or using it for ill intent, then I'm comfortable with that. Because the more I know, the more I can create risk categories, true risk categories, not just the two-size-fits-alls that we have now, which is pre-check or not pre-check, but really understanding more about people. So you can get to a point where, if Christine Wormuth comes to the airport and you take the same kind of flight every time, we know who you are, you're a frequent flyer, you've said, hey, I don't mind you knowing a little bit more about me if it makes things simpler. And simpler is not just simpler for you, it's simpler for the system, because security is about subtraction. You want to the extent you can subtract people from an equation, then you can focus on the people and things that are left. So take the pressure off the checkpoint. So that's one way to do it. And that can be done through a lot of the systems that you mentioned, facial recognition, technology that allows you to let your cell phone signal who and where you are for discrete purposes, things that then create comfort in the system that somebody like you is not going to take advantage of the system, and we know enough about you. So that's one aspect of how it can change. I think the other aspect is just dramatically changing the way in which we do security. So the current checkpoint, I think, can't survive as it is. It's cumbersome. It'll never keep up with the volume increase in traffic. So moving more towards scanning at speed, what they call speed of light type scanning. So there are all sorts of interesting new systems out there that would do a scan for prohibited items on the fly. Much more fidelity to the system. They're more capable. A lot of these things are in testing right now. Dubai is experimenting with the so-called tunnel that you walk through, where they're doing some facial recognition and they're doing other types of millimeter wave scanning as you're moving through, just to keep things moving through. Again, for those people you know least about, those people and things you know least about. But I think there's a real opportunity with machine learning to the place that it is now, with the kinds of advances in computed tomography scanning, the 3D scanners that they're using at checkpoints, with what we've learned about how to train people more effectively, so that they're better at what they do, and getting humans doing what humans do best. I think there's a lot of opportunity in the future to transform things.
What do you think about, as I listen to you talk about it, I think one of the, a couple of challenges leap to my mind. One is, I think, many Americans, certainly including myself, know that our phones and things are these incredibly powerful tools, but we don't really understand too much about them. Right. And, so Apple or various other apps, periodically will come and say, please, for me to be able to access whatever information I want to access on my phone, they will periodically make me check a box that says, I agree, to a whole bunch of legalese that's in print so small that I can't read it. And I do sometimes wonder, what am I signing away? Like, what am I giving to big technology company X? Well, I don't really care because I just want to be able to do whatever it is I want to do on the phone.
Yeah, you have to do it to use your phone.
And so I do think, on the one hand, I think Americans, love their technology, but we also are starting to worry about it a little bit more, and are starting to wonder about how much information we've already given to companies like Google, like Facebook, and like what have you. And one of the things I hear is you describe that kind of a future. Certainly it would be wonderful to be able to move through the airports more quickly like that. But I also worry a little bit that many Americans might not have a lot of comfort in, because in part so few of us really understand the technology behind all of this, that we would be giving away a lot of information about ourselves and not really feeling very confident about how it's going to be used or whether we can trust the purposes for which it's going to be used.
Yeah, and I agree wholeheartedly. That's why I said, so the ideal is that you have that identity, but the reality is that there's a lot of concerns with respect to sharing of information. That's why I'm really intrigued by the technology foundations that allow you to own your own data. So there's a lot of blockchain is one type of technology that can do that, but there's a lot of work being put into this idea that you are your token, meaning you have to be present for access to happen, and the data is not centrally managed. So it's a distributed data. It's a distributed ledger, if you will, and if anybody tries to access that ledger without your permission, it becomes instantly noticeable. I rapidly get into trouble if I talk too much about the underlying technology. And my brother, who's a software engineer, always yells at me for getting it wrong. But I think that the key is going to be that piece. How do you give ownership back to the individual of the data? And there's a huge move to begin to think about how to do that, to get the data out of the hands of the big companies that are commoditizing you, monetizing you. I always tell what do they always say? There's a reason that you don't pay for Google and Facebook and the like, because you're the product. They're making money off of you.
Your former agency was born out of a moment of what I would call a strategic surprise for the United States. While we had bits and pieces about Al-Qaeda, we didn't really see it coming. And so 9/11 was a pretty catastrophic surprise for us that deeply affected our entire country. And I suspect, in the future, we're going to continue to be surprised, whether it's from a terrorist group or some other kind of enemy. When you think about the future, drawing on your long career in the Coast Guard and your responsibilities as TSA administrator, what is it that you worry about, and what is it that you think that we may not be thinking enough about in terms of security threats that we need to put more emphasis on?
Well, you've hinted strongly at what they are. One is, I think, if you're not careful, you spend all your time looking in the rearview mirror. And by that I mean we put great systems in place to counter the last threat, and you have to do that. Terrorists don't take tools out of their kit, but we need to become more predictive and more comfortable with this notion of strategic surprise or asymmetry, or however you want to talk about it. And I think you can do that. We also have to stop not be complacent. Just because we haven't had another attack, it doesn't mean people aren't trying to attack us, and it doesn't mean attacks aren't happening. We can look around the world. So recognize that there's still a strong desire to attack transportation systems. Aviation is still a huge target. I think the lack of attack tells you a lot about the successes that have been happening overseas. I think the intelligence community has done a superb job of understanding the players that are of concern and then targeting those players to the extent possible. And so I think people should be comfortable that you have a really strong community of people paying attention to these things. But people, terrorists can get lucky. We probably at some point are not going to be able to stop everything, and there's always going to be a risk. The only risk-free system will be one where nothing moves, and so there's always a chance that it can happen. So you have to be prepared for the potential for it to happen, because I think you can still interrupt it in progress if you're looking for something unlike the thing you just saw. For example, the Brussels bombers. I had just landed at Brussels Airport on March 22nd, 2016, and that was the morning of the attacks on the Brussels Airport and then the Brussels metro system. And I was still on the plane. Our aircraft was never in danger, but we were sitting at the gate, just waiting for the jet bridge to come across when the bombs went off. If you look back at what those individuals did, without getting into all the details, these were three individuals that went to an airport by taxi, got in a taxi, couldn't get all their suitcases in the taxi, so they just arbitrarily left a couple behind. That's the first indication something was unusual. They got to the airport, and they never made an attempt to even approach a ticket counter for checking their bags. They just wandered around in the front of the airport. And in retrospect, you can see that clearly on the video of the event, the closed circuit TV capture. But you can imagine a system that could look at that and say, there's something just unusual about that. Might be perfectly normal. Maybe they're just confused. Maybe they got to the airport early. Maybe they're waiting for another person to show up. But you can imagine a system that's more forward-looking that could have said, that just doesn't look normal. I mean, there's something that goes back to that, that visibility identity piece. The more you can capture what a normal system looks like of normal people, risk-free people coming through, the more some of those anomalous situations might stand out. So I think that as going forward, we need systems that are more predictive in nature, and that starts with understanding what is a true normal environment look like over time. I mean, you're not going to capture that in one snapshot, but over time, you can get a pretty good standard picture of what a normal distribution looks like, so that you see these things that don't look normal anymore. Or maybe look too normal, if you understand. I mean, I remember talking to some of my friends in the intelligence community. They said too normal can be abnormal as well. So I think that it goes back to why I think it's critical that we understand the system more effectively. We stop looking at just the points of security, but we look at the whole ecosystem, and we think of an architecture of security so that you can begin to understand what's moving around inside that architecture, and you can see these things that don't look normal. Because you're not going to stop everybody from getting to the point of potentially doing the damage. You hope that intelligence works. You hope that you roll people up well in advance, but every now and then they'll get real close to the boom part of the equation, and I don't think it's acceptable to just say, oh well, we did our best. I think we're missing that piece at the end that says, hey, if you understand that system really well, you can actually begin to do some real predictive modeling that says that doesn't look right.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah. Well, thank you so much.
Would
love
you,
to carry on this conversation, but it was great to talk with you. Thank you for all your time.
Thanks very much. It was a real pleasure to be here. Thanks.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Resilient World. If you enjoyed the podcast, please don't forget to rate and subscribe to us in Apple Podcast Store, where you can also find our previous episodes. We'll see you again in 2 weeks.